Welcome to Nighttale Audiobook's YouTube channel. Tonight, we journey back to the hallowed, echoing halls of 19th century Rugby School, where a young boy's character is forged in the fires of discipline, sport, and rivalry. This is Tom Brown's Schooldays by Thomas Hughes. Follow Tom as he trades the comforts of home for the rough-and-tumble world of the English boarding school, a place where every game of football is a battle, and every bully must eventually be faced. It is a story of grit, honor, and the long road to becoming a man. So, straighten your collar, take your seat in the rafters, and prepare for a classic tale of old-school pluck. The lesson begins now. Tom Brown's Schooldays by Thomas Hughes. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Brown Family. I'm the poet of White Horse Vale, sir, with liberal notions under my cap. Ballad. The Browns have become illustrious by the pen of Thackeray and the pencil of Doyle within the memory of the young gentlemen who are now matriculating at the universities. Notwithstanding the well-merited but late fame which has now fallen upon them, anyone at all acquainted with the family must feel that much has yet to be written and said before the British nation will be properly sensible of how much of its greatness it owes to the Browns. For centuries, in their quiet, dogged, homespun way, they have been subduing the earth in most English counties and leaving their mark in American forests and Australian uplands. Wherever the fleets and armies of England have won renown, their stalwart sons of the Browns have done yeoman's work. With the yew-bow and cloth-yard shaft at Cressy and Agincourt, with the brown bill and pike under the brave Lord Willoughby, with culverin and demi-culverin against Spaniards and Dutchmen, with hand grenade and sabre and musket and bayonet under Rodney and St. Vincent, Wolfe and Moore, Nelson and Wellington, they have carried their lives in their hands, getting hard knocks and hard work in plenty, which was on the whole what they looked for, and the best thing for them, and little praise or pudding, which indeed they and most of us are better without. Talbots and Stanleys, St. Maurs and such like folk, have led armies and made laws time out of mind. But those noble families would be somewhat astounded, if the accounts ever came to be fairly taken, to find how small their work for England has been by the side of that of the Browns. These latter, indeed, have, until the present generation, rarely been sung by poet or chronicled by sage. They have wanted their sacer vates, having been too solid to rise to the top by themselves, and not having been largely gifted with the talent of catching hold of and holding on tight to whatever good things happen to be going, the foundation of the fortunes of so many noble families. But the world goes on its way, and the wheel turns, and the wrongs of the Browns, like other wrongs, seem in a fair way to get righted. And this present writer, having for many years of his life been a devout Brown worshipper, and, moreover, having the honour of being nearly connected with an eminently respectable branch of the great Brown family, is anxious, so far as in him lies, to help the wheel over and throw his stone onto the pile. However, gentle reader, or simple reader, whichever you may be, lest you should be led to waste your precious time upon these pages, I make so bold as at once to tell you the sort of folk you'll have to meet and put up with if you and I are to jog on comfortably together. You shall hear at once what sort of folk the Browns are, at least my branch of them, and then if you don't like the sort, why, cut the concern at once and let you and I cry quits before either of us can grumble at the other. In the first place, the Browns are a fighting family. One may question their wisdom or wit or beauty, but about their fight, there can be no question. Wherever hard knocks of any kind, visible or invisible, are going, there the Brown who is nearest must shove in his carcass. And these carcasses, for the most part, answer very well to the characteristic propensity. They are a square-headed and snake-necked generation, broad in the shoulder, deep in the chest, and thin in the flank, carrying no lumber. Then, for clanship, they are as bad as Highlanders. It is amazing the belief they have in one another. With them, there is nothing like the Browns, to the third and fourth generation. Blood is thicker than water, is one of their pet sayings. They can't be happy unless they are always meeting one another. Never were such people for family gatherings, which, were you a stranger or sensitive, you might think had better not have been gathered together. For during the whole time of their being together, they luxuriate in telling one another their minds on whatever subject turns up. And their minds are wonderfully antagonistic, and all their opinions are downright beliefs. Till you've been among them some time and understand them, you can't think but that they are quarreling. Not a bit of it. They love and respect one another 10 times the more after a good set family arguing bout, and go back, one to his curacy, another to his chambers, and another to his regiment, freshened for work, and more than ever convinced that the Browns are the height of company. This family training, too, combined with their turn for combativeness, makes them eminently quixotic. They can't let anything alone which they think going wrong. They must speak their mind about it, annoying all easy-going folk, and spend their time and money in having a tinker at it, however hopeless the job. It is an impossibility to a Brown to leave the most disreputable lame dog on the other side of a stile. Most other folk get tired of such work. The old Browns, with red faces, white whiskers, and bald heads, go on believing and fighting to a green old age. They have always a crotchet going, till the old man with the scythe reaps and garners them away for troublesome old boys as they are. And the most provoking thing is that no failures knock them up, or make them hold their hands, or think you or me or other sane people in the right. Failures slide off them like July rain off a duck's back feathers. Jem and his whole family turn out bad and cheat them one week, and the next they are doing the same thing for Jack. And when he goes to the treadmill, and his wife and children to the workhouse, they will be on the lookout for Bill to take his place. However, it is time for us to get from the general to the particular, so leaving the great army of Browns who are scattered over the whole empire on which the sun never sets, and whose general diffusion I take to be the chief cause of that empire's stability, let us at once fix our attention upon the small nest of Browns in which our hero was hatched, and which dwelt in that portion of the royal county of Berks which is called the Vale of White Horse. Most of you have probably traveled down the Great Western Railway as far as Swindon. Those of you who did so with their eyes open have been aware, soon after leaving the Didcot station, of a fine range of chalk hills running parallel with the railway on the left-hand side as you go down, and distant some 2 or 3 miles, more or less, from the line. The highest point in the range is the White Horse Hill, which you come in front of just before you stop at the Shrivenham station. If you love English scenery and have a few hours to spare, you can't do better the next time you pass than stop at the Farringdon Road or Shrivenham station and make your way to that highest point. And those who care for the vague old stories that haunt countrysides all about England will not, if they are wise, be content with only a few hours' stay. For glorious as the view is, the neighborhood is yet more interesting for its relics of bygone times. I only know 2 English neighborhoods thoroughly, and in each, within a circle of 5 miles, there is enough of interest and beauty to last any reasonable man his life. I believe this to be the case almost throughout the country, but each has a special attraction, and none can be richer than the one I am speaking of, and going to introduce you to very particularly. For on this subject, I must be prosy, so those that don't care for England in detail may skip the chapter. Oh, young England, young England, you who are born into these racing railroad times, when there's a great exhibition or some monster sight every year, and you can get over a couple of 1,000 miles of ground for £3.10 in a 5 weeks holiday. Why don't you know more of your own birthplaces? You're all in the ends of the earth, it seems to me, as soon as you get your necks out of the educational collar for midsummer holidays, long vacations, or whatnot, going round Ireland with a return ticket in a fortnight, dropping your copies of Tennyson on the tops of Swiss mountains, or pulling down the Danube in Oxford racing boats. And when you get home for a quiet fortnight, you turn the steam off and lie on your backs in the paternal garden, surrounded by the last batch of books from Moody's library and half bored to death. Well, I know it has its good side. You all patter French, more or less, and perhaps German. You have seen men in cities, no doubt, and have your opinions, such as they are, about schools of painting, high art, and all that. Have seen the pictures of Dresden and the Louvre, and know the taste of sauerkraut. All I say is you don't know your own lanes and woods and fields. Though you may be chock full of science, not 1 in 20 of you knows where to find the wood sorrel or bee orchis, which grow in the next wood, or on the down 3 miles off, or what the bog bean and wood sage are good for. And as for the country legends, the stories of the old gable-ended farmhouses, the place where the last skirmish was fought in the Civil Wars, where the parish butt stood, where the last highwayman turned to bay, where the last ghost was laid by the parson, they are gone out of date altogether. Now, in my time, when we got home by the old coach, which put us down at the crossroads with our boxes the first day of the holidays, and had been driven off by the family coachman singing Dulce Domum at the top of our voices, there we were, fixtures, till Black Monday came round. We had to cut out our own amusements within a walk or a ride of home. And so we got to know all the country folk and their ways and songs and stories by heart, and went over the fields and woods and hills again and again, till we made friends of them all. We were Berkshire or Gloucestershire or Yorkshire boys, and your young cosmopolites, belonging to all countries and no countries. No doubt it's all right. I dare say it is. This is the day of large views and glorious humanity and all that. But I wish backsword play hadn't gone out in the Vale of Whitehorse, and that confounded Great Western hadn't carried away Alfred's Hill to make an embankment. But to return to the said Vale of Whitehorse, the country in which the first scenes of this true and interesting story are laid. As I said, the Great Western now runs right through it, and it is a land of large, rich pastures, bounded by ox fences, and covered with fine hedgerow timber, with here and there a nice little gorse or spinney, where abideth poor Charlie, having no other cover to which to betake himself for miles and miles, when pushed out some fine November morning by the old Berkshire. Those who have been there, and well mounted, only know how he and the staunch little pack who dash after him, heads high and sterns low, with a breast-high scent, can consume the ground at such times. There being little ploughland and few woods, the Vale is only an average sporting country, except for hunting. The villages are straggling, queer, old-fashioned places, the houses being dropped down without the least regularity, in nooks and out-of-the-way corners, by the sides of shadowy lanes and footpaths, each with its patch of garden. They are built chiefly of good grey stone, and thatched, though I see that within the last year or two the red brick cottages are multiplying, for the Vale is beginning to manufacture largely, both bricks and tiles. There are lots of waste ground by the side of the roads in every village, amounting often to village greens, where feed the pigs and ganders of the people. And these roads are old-fashioned, homely roads, very dirty and badly made, and hardly endurable in winter, but still pleasant jog-trot roads running through the great pasture lands, dotted here and there with little clumps of thorns, where the sleek kine are feeding, with no fence on either side of them, and a gate at the end of each field, which makes you get out of your gig, if you keep one, and gives you a chance of looking about you every quarter of a mile. One of the moralists whom we sat under in our youth, Was it the great Richard Swiveller or Mr. Stiggins? Says, "We are born in a vale, and must take the consequences of being found in such a situation. These consequences I, for one, am ready to encounter. I pity people who weren't born in a vale. I don't mean a flat country, but a vale. That is, a flat country bounded by hills. The having your hill always in view if you choose to turn towards him, that's the essence of a vale. There he is forever in the distance, your friend and companion. You never lose him as you do in hilly districts." And then, what a hill is the White Horse Hill. There it stands right up above all the rest, 900 feet above the sea, and the boldest, bravest shape for a chalk hill that you ever saw. Let us go up to the top of him and see what is to be found there. Aye, you may well wonder and think it odd you never heard of this before, but wonder or not, as you please, there are hundreds of such things lying about England, which wiser folk than you know nothing of and care nothing for. Yes, it's a magnificent Roman camp, and no mistake, with gates and ditch and mounds, all as complete as it was 20 years after the strong old rogues left it. Here, right up on the highest point, from which they say you can see 11 counties, they trenched round all the tableland, some 12 or 14 acres, as was their custom, for they couldn't bear anybody to overlook them, and made their eyrie. The ground falls away rapidly on all sides. Was there ever such turf in the whole world? You sink up to your ankles at every step, and yet the spring of it is delicious. There is always a breeze in the camp, as it is called, and here it lies, just as the Romans left it, except that cairn on the east side, left by Her Majesty's Corps of Sappers and Miners the other day, when they and the engineer officer had finished their sojourn there, and their surveys for the ordnance map of Berkshire. It is altogether a place that you won't forget, a place to open a man's soul and make him prophesy as he looks down on that great vale spread out as the garden of the Lord before him, and wave on wave of the mysterious downs behind, and to the right and left the chalk hills running away into the distance, along which he can trace for miles the old Roman road, the ridgeway, the rudge as the country folk call it, keeping straight along the highest back of the hills. Such a place as Balak brought Balaam to, and told him to prophesy against the people in the valley beneath. And he could not. Neither shall you, for they are a people of the Lord who abide there. And now we leave the camp and descend towards the west, and are on the Ashdown. We are treading on heroes. It is sacred ground for Englishmen, more sacred than all but 1 or 2 fields where their bones lie whitening. For this is the actual place where our Alfred won his great battle, the Battle of Ashdown, a sendum in the chroniclers, which broke the Danish power and made England a Christian land. The Danes held the camp and the slope where we are standing, the whole crown of the hill, in fact. The heathen had beforehand seized the higher ground, as old Asser says, having wasted everything behind them from London, and being just ready to burst down on the fair vale, Alfred's own birthplace and heritage. And up the heights came the Saxons, as they did at the Alma. The Christians led up their line from the lower ground. There stood also on that same spot a single thorn tree, marvelous stumpy, which we ourselves with our very own eyes have seen. Bless the old chronicler. Does he think nobody ever saw the single thorn tree but himself? Why, there it stands to this very day, just on the edge of the slope, and I saw it not 3 weeks since. An old single thorn tree, marvellous stumpy. At least, if it isn't the same tree, it ought to have been, for it's just in the place where the battle must have been won or lost, around which, as I was saying, the 2 lines of foemen came together in battle with a huge shout. And in this place, one of the 2 kings of the heathen, and 5 of his earls fell down and died, and many thousands of the heathen side in the same place. After which crowning mercy, the pious king, that there might never be wanting a sign and a memorial to the countryside, carved out on the northern side of the chalk hill, under the camp, where it is almost precipitous, the great Saxon white horse, which he who will may see from the railway, and which gives its name to the vale, over which it has looked these 1,000 years and more. Right down below the white horse is a curious deep and broad gully called the Manger, into one side of which the hills fall with a series of the most lovely sweeping curves known as the Giant's Stairs. They are not a bit like staters, but I never saw anything like them anywhere else, with their short green turf and tender bluebells and gossamer and thistledown gleaming in the sun, and the sheep paths running along their sides like ruled lines. The other side of the Manger is formed by the Dragon's Hill, a curious little round, self-confident fellow, thrown forward from the range, utterly unlike everything round him. On this hill, some deliverer of mankind, St. George, the country folk used to tell me, killed a dragon. Whether it were St. George, I cannot say, but surely a dragon was killed there, for you may see the marks yet where his blood ran down. And more by token, the place where it ran down is the easiest way up the hillside. Passing along the ridgeway to the west for about a mile, we come to a little clump of young beech and firs, with a growth of thorn and privet underwood. Here you may find nests of the strong down partridge and peewit, but take care that the keeper isn't down upon you. And in the middle of it is an old cromlech, a huge flat stone raised on 7 or 8 others, and led up to by a path with large single stones set up on each side. This is Wayland Smith's cave, a place of classic fame now, but as Sir Walter has touched it, I may as well let it alone and refer you to Kenilworth for the legend. The thick, deep wood which you see in the hollow about a mile off surrounds Ashdown Park, built by Inigo Jones. 4 broad alleys are cut through the wood from circumference to center, and each leads to one face of the house. The mystery of the downs hangs about house and wood as they stand there alone, so unlike all around, with the green slopes studded with great stones just about this part, stretching away on all sides. It was a wise Lord Craven, I think, who pitched his tent there. Passing along the ridgeway to the east, we soon come to cultivated land. The downs, strictly so called, are no more. Lincolnshire farmers have been imported, and the long, fresh slopes are sheep walks no more, but grow famous turnips and barley. One of these improvers lives over there at the 7 Barrows farm, another mystery of the Great Downs. There are the barrows still, solemn and silent, like ships in the calm sea, the sepulchres of some sons of men. But of whom? It is 3 miles from the White Horse, too far for the slain of Ashdown to be buried there. Who shall say what heroes are waiting there? But we must get down into the vale again, and so away by the Great Western Railway to town, for time and the printer's devil press, and it is a terrible long and slippery descent, and a shocking bad road. At the bottom, however, there is a pleasant public, whereat we must really take a modest quencher, for the down air is provocative of thirst. So we pull up under an old oak which stands before the door. "What is the name of your hill, landlord?" "Blowing Stowen Hill, sir, to be sure." "Stewum?" "Stone, stupid, the blowing stone." "And of your house? I can't make out the sign." "Blowing Stowen, sir," says the landlord, pouring out his old ale from a Toby Philpot jug with a melodious crash into the long-necked glass. "What queer names," say we, sighing at the end of our draught and holding out the glass to be replenished. "Bean't queer at all, as I can see, sir," says mine host, handing back our glass, "seeing as this here is the blowing Stwon hisself, putting his hand on a square lump of stone, some 3.5 feet high, perforated with 2 or 3 queer holes, like petrified antediluvian rat holes, which lies there close under the oak, under our very nose. We are more than ever puzzled, and drink our second glass of ale, wondering what will come next. "Like to hear un, sir?" says mine host, setting down Toby Philpot on the tray and resting both hands on the stwan. We are ready for anything, and he, without waiting for a reply, applies his mouth to one of the rat holes. Something must come of it, if he doesn't burst. Good heavens, I hope he has no apoplectic tendencies. Yes, here it comes, sure enough, a gruesome sound, between a moan and a roar, and spreads itself away over the valley, and up the hillside, and into the woods at the back of the house, a ghost-like, awful voice. Do say, sir," says mine host, rising purple-faced, while the moan is still coming out of the swan, "as they used in old times to warn the countryside by blowing the swan when the enemy was a-comin', and as how folks could make an heerd then for 7 mile round. Leastways, so I've heerd Lawyer Smith say, and he knows a smart sight about them old times." We can hardly swallow Lawyer Smith's 7 miles, but could the blowing of the stone have been a summons, a sort of sending the fiery cross round the neighbourhood in the old times? What old times? Who knows? We pay for our beer, and are thankful. "And what's the name of the village just below, landlord?" "Kingstone Lisle, sir." "Fine plantations you've got here." "Yes, sir, the squire's amazing fond of trees and such like." "No wonder. He's got some real beauties to be fond of." "Good day, landlord." "Good day, sir, and a pleasant ride to-y." "And now, my boys, you whom I want to get for readers, have you had enough? Will you give in at once and say you're convinced and let me begin my story? Or will you have more of it? Remember, I've only been over a little bit of the hillside yet, what you could ride round easily on your ponies in an hour. I'm only just come down into the Vale by Blowing Stone Hill, and if I once begin about the Vale, what's to stop me? You'll have to hear all about Wantage, the birthplace of Alfred, and Farringdon, which held out so long for Charles I. Revale was near Oxford, and dreadfully malignant, full of Throgmortons, Puseys, and Pies, and such like, and their brawny retainers. Did you ever read Thomas Ingoldsby's Legend of Hamilton Tye? If you haven't, you ought to have. Well, Farringdon is where he lived before he went to sea. His real name was Hampden Pye, and the Pies were the great folk at Farringdon. Then there's Pusey. You've heard of the Pusey horn, which King Canute gave to the Puseys of that day, and which the gallant old squire, lately gone to his rest, whom Berkshire freeholders turned out of last Parliament to their eternal disgrace for voting according to his conscience, used to bring out on high days, holidays, and bonfire nights. And the splendid old cross church at Uffington, the Uffingas town, how the whole countryside teems with Saxon names and memories. And the old moated grange at Compton, nestled close under the hillside, where 20 Marianas may have lived, with its bright water lilies in the moat, and its yew walk, the cloister walk, and its peerless terraced gardens. There they all are, and 20 things beside, for those who care about them and have eyes. And these are the sort of things you may find, I believe, every one of you, in any common English country neighborhood. Will you look for them under your own noses, or will you not? Well, I've done what I can to make you, and if you will go gadding over half Europe now every holidays, I can't help it. I was born and bred a West Country man, thank God, a Wessex man, a citizen of the noblest Saxon kingdom of Wessex, a regular angular Saxon, the very soul of me, ad scriptus gleba. There's nothing like the old countryside for me, and no music like the twang of the real old Saxon tongue, as one gets it fresh from the veritable chaw in the White Horse Vale. And I say with Garge Riddler, the old West Country yeoman, "Through all the world old Garge would boast, commend me to merry old England most. While voles goes prating fur and nigh, we stops at home, my dog and I. Here, at any rate, lived and stopped at home Squire Brown, J.P. for the county of Berks, in a village near the foot of the White Horse Range. And here he dealt out justice and mercy in a rough way, and begat sons and daughters, and hunted the fox, and grumbled at the badness of the roads and the times. And his wife dealt out stockings and calico shirts and smock frocks, and comforting drinks to the old folks with the rheumatiz, and good counsel to all, and kept the coal and clothes clubs going for Yuletide, when the bands of mummers came round, dressed out in ribbons and colored paper caps, and stamped round the squire's kitchen, repeating in true sing-song vernacular the legend of St. George and his fight, and the 10-pound doctor, who plays his part at healing the saint, a relic, I believe, of the old Middle Age mysteries. It was the first dramatic representation which greeted the eyes of little Tom, who was brought down into the kitchen by his nurse to witness it, at the mature age of 3 years. Tom was the eldest child of his parents, and from his earliest babyhood exhibited the family characteristics in great strength. He was a hearty, strong boy from the first, given to fighting with and escaping from his nurse, and fraternizing with all the village boys, with whom he made expeditions all round the neighborhood. And here, in the quiet, old-fashioned country village, under the shadow of the everlasting hills, Tom Brown was reared, and never left it till he went first to school, when nearly 8 years of age. For in those days, change of air twice a year was not thought absolutely necessary for the health of all Her Majesty's lieges. I have been credibly informed, and am inclined to believe, that the various boards of directors of railway companies, those gigantic jobbers and bribers, while quarreling about everything else, agreed together some 10 years back to buy up the learned profession of medicine, body and soul. To this end, they set apart several millions of money, which they continually distribute judiciously among the doctors, stipulating only this one thing, that they shall prescribe change of air to every patient who can pay or borrow money to pay a railway fare, and see their prescription carried out. If it be not for this, why is it that none of us can be well at home for a year together? It wasn't so 20 years ago, not a bit of it. The Browns didn't go out of the country once in 5 years. A visit to Reading or Abingdon twice a year, at assizes or quarter sessions, which the squire made on his horse with a pair of saddlebags containing his wardrobe, a stay of a day or two at some country neighbor's, or an expedition to a county ball or the yeomanry review, made up the sum of the Brown locomotion in most years. A stray Brown from some distant county dropped in every now and then, or from Oxford, on grave nag, an old Don, contemporary of the squire, and were looked upon by the Brown household and the villagers with the same sort of feeling with which we now regard a man who has crossed the Rocky Mountains, or launched a boat on the Great Lake in Central Africa. The White Horse Vale, remember, was traversed by no great road, nothing but country parish roads, and these very bad. Only one coach ran there, and this one only from Wantage to London, so that the western part of the Vale was without regular means of moving on, and certainly didn't seem to want them. There was the canal, by the way, which supplied the countryside with coal, and up and down which continually went the long barges, with the big black men lounging by the side of the horses along the towing path, and the women in bright-colored handicrafts standing in the sterns, steering. Standing, I say, but you could never see whether they were standing or sitting, all but their heads and shoulders being out of sight in the cozy little cabins which occupied some 8 feet of the stern, and which Tom Brown pictured to himself as the most desirable of residences. His nurse told him that those good-natured-looking women were in the constant habit of enticing children into the barges, and taking them up to London and selling them, which Tom wouldn't believe, and which made him resolve as soon as possible to accept the oft-proffered invitation of these sirens to young master to come in and have a ride. But as yet, the nurse was too much for Tom. Yet, why should I, after all, abuse the gadabout propensities of my countrymen? We are a vagabond nation now, that's certain, for better for worse. I am a vagabond. I have been away from home no less than 5 distinct times in the last year. The Queen sets us the example. We are moving on from top to bottom. Little dirty Jack, who abides in Clement's Inn gateway and blacks my boots for a penny, takes his month's hop-picking every year as a matter of course. Why shouldn't he? I'm delighted at it. I love vagabonds, only I prefer poor to rich ones. Couriers and ladies' maids, imperials and travelling carriages are an abomination unto me. I cannot away with them. But for dirty Jack and every good fellow who, in the words of the capital French song, moves about. Comme le limaçon, portant tout son bagage, ses meubles, sa maison. On his own back, why, good luck to them, and many a merry roadside adventure and steaming supper in the chimney corners of roadside inns, Swiss chalets, Hottentot crawls, or wherever else they like to go. So, having succeeded in contradicting myself in my first chapter, which gives me great hopes that you will all go on and think me a good fellow notwithstanding my crotchets, I shall here shut up for the present, and consider my ways, having resolved to sar it out, as we say in the Vale, holus bolus, just as it comes, and then you'll probably get the truth out of me. Chapter 2. The VEAST. And the king commandeth and forbiddeth that from henceforth neither fairs nor markets be kept in churchyards, for the honour of the church. Statutes, 13 Edward I, Stat 2nd, Cap 6. As that venerable and learned poet, whose voluminous works we all think it the correct thing to admire and talk about, but don't read often, most truly says, the child is father to the man. A fortiori, therefore, he must be father to the boy. So as we are going, at any rate, to see Tom Brown through his boyhood, supposing we never get any farther, which, if you show a proper sense of the value of this history, there is no knowing but what we may, let us have a look at the life and environments of the child in the quiet country village to which we were introduced in the last chapter. Tom, as has been already said, was a robust and combative urchin, and at the age of 4 began to struggle against the yoke and authority of his nurse. That functionary was a good-hearted, tearful, scatterbrained girl, lately taken by Tom's mother, Madam Brown, as she was called, from the village school to be trained as nursery maid. Madam Brown was a rare trainer of servants, and spent herself freely in the profession, for profession it was, and gave her more trouble by half than many people take to earn a good income. Her servants were known and sought after for miles round. Almost all the girls who attained a certain place in the village school were taken by her, 1 or 2 at a time, as housemaids, laundry maids, nursery maids, or kitchen maids, and after a year or 2's training were started in life amongst the neighboring families, with good principles and wardrobes. One of the results of this system was the perpetual despair of Mrs. Brown's cook and own maid, who no sooner had a notable girl made to their hands than Mrs. was sure to find a good place for her and send her off, taking in fresh importations from the school. Another was that the house was always full of young girls with clean, shining faces who broke plates and scorched linen, but made an atmosphere of cheerful, homely life about the place, good for everyone who came within its influence. Mrs. Brown loved young people, and, in fact, human creatures in general, above plates and linen. They were more like a lot of elder children than servants, and felt to her more as a mother or aunt than as a mistress. Tom's nurse was one who took in her instruction very slowly. She seemed to have 2 left hands and no head, and so Mrs. Brown kept her on longer than usual, that she might expend her awkwardness and forgetfulness upon those who would not judge and punish her too strictly for them. Charity Lamb was her name. It had been the immemorial habit of the village to christen children either by Bible names or by those of the cardinal and other virtues, so that one was forever hearing in the village street or on the green shrill sounds of "Prudence, Prudence, thee come out of the gutter," or "Mercy, drat the girl, what bist thee a-doin' wi' little Faith?" And there were Ruths, Rachels, Keziahs in every corner. The same with the boys. They were Benjamins, Jacobs, Noahs, Enochs. I suppose the custom has come down from Puritan times. There it is, at any rate, very strong still in the Vale. Well, from early morning till dewy eve, when she had it out of him in the cold tub before putting him to bed, Charity and Tom were pitted against one another. Physical power was as yet on the side of Charity, but she hadn't a chance with him wherever head work was wanted. This war of independence began every morning before breakfast, when Charity escorted her charge to a neighboring farmhouse, which supplied the Browns, and where, by his mother's wish, Master Tom went to drink whey before breakfast. Tom had no sort of objection to whey, but he had a decided liking for curds, which were forbidden as unwholesome, and there was seldom a morning that he did not manage to secure a handful of hard curds in defiance of Charity and of the farmer's wife. The latter good soul was a gaunt, angular woman who, with an old black bonnet on the top of her head, the strings dangling about her shoulders, and her gown tucked through her pocket holes, went clattering about the dairy, cheese room, and yard in high pattens. Charity was some sort of niece of the old lady's, and was consequently free of the farmhouse and garden, into which she could not resist going for the purposes of gossip and flirtation with the heir apparent, who was a dawdling fellow, never out at work as he ought to have been. The moment Charity had found her cousin, or any other occupation, Tom would slip away, and in a minute shrill cries would be heard from the dairy. "Charity! Charity! Thee lazy hussy! Where bist?" And Tom would break cover, hands and mouth full of curds, and take refuge on the shaky surface of the great muck reservoir in the middle of the yard, disturbing the repose of the great pigs. Here he was in safety, as no grown person could follow without getting over their knees, and the luckless Charity, while her aunt scolded her from the dairy door for being "allus hankering about arter our Willum instead of minding Master Tom," would descend from threats to coaxing to lure Tom out of the muck which was rising over his shoes, and would soon tell a tale on his stockings, for which she would be sure to catch it from Mrs.'s maid. Tom had two abettors, in the shape of a couple of old boys, Noah and Benjamin by name, who defended him from Charity and expended much time upon his education. They were both of them retired servants of former generations of the Browns. Noah Crook was a keen, dry old man of almost 90, but still able to totter about. He talked to Tom quite as if he were one of his own family, and indeed had long completely identified the Browns with himself. In some remote age he had been the attendant of a Miss Brown, and had conveyed her about the country on a pillion. He had a little round picture of the identical grey horse, caparisoned with the identical pillion, before which he used to do a sort of fetish worship, and abuse turnpike roads and carriages. He wore an old full-bottomed wig, the gift of some dandy old Brown whom he had valeted in the middle of last century, which habiliment Master Tom looked upon with considerable respect, not to say fear, and indeed his whole feeling towards Noah was strongly tainted with awe. And when the old gentleman was gathered to his fathers, Tom's lamentation over him was not unaccompanied by a certain joy at having seen the last of the wig. "Poor old Noah, dead and gone," said he. "Tom Brown's so sorry. Put him in the coffin, wig and all." But old Benji was young Master's real delight and refuge. He was a youth by the side of Noah, scarce 70 years old. A cheery, humorous, kind-hearted old man, full of 60 years of Vale gossip, and of all sorts of helpful ways for young and old, but above all, for children. It was he who bent the first pin with which Tom extracted his first stickleback out of Pebbly Brook, the little stream which ran through the village.
The first stickleback was a splendid fellow, with fabulous red and blue gills. Tom kept him in a small basin till the day of his death, and became a fisherman from that day. Within a month from the taking of the first stickleback, Benji had carried off our hero to the canal, in defiance of charity. And between them, after a whole afternoon's pop-joying, they had caught 3 or 4 small, coarse fish and a perch, averaging perhaps 2.5 ounces each, which Tom bore home in rapture to his mother as a precious gift, and which she received, like a true mother, with equal rapture, instructing the cook, nevertheless, in a private interview, not to prepare the same for the squire's dinner.
Charity had appealed against old Benji in the meantime, representing the dangers of the canal banks. But Mrs. Brown, seeing the boy's inaptitude for female guidance, had decided in Benji's favor, and from thenceforth the old man was Tom's dry nurse. And as they sat by the canal watching their little green and white float, Benji would instruct him in the doings of deceased Browns, how his grandfather, in the early days of the Great War, when there was much distress and crime in the Vale, and the magistrates had been threatened by the mob, had ridden in with a big stick in his hand and held the petty sessions by himself. How his great-uncle, the rector, had encountered and laid the last ghost who had frightened the old women, male and female, of the parish out of their senses, and who turned out to be the blacksmith's apprentice, disguised in drink and a white sheet. It was Benji, too, who saddled Tom's first pony and instructed him in the mysteries of horsemanship, teaching him to throw his weight back and keep his hand low, and who stood chuckling outside the door of the girls' school when Tom rode his little Shetland into the cottage and round the table, where the old dame and her pupils were seated at their work. Benji himself was come of a family distinguished in the Vale for their prowess in all athletic games. Some 6 of his brothers and kinsmen had gone to the wars, of whom only one had survived to come home, with a small pension and 3 bullets in different parts of his body. He had shared Benji's cottage till his death, and had left him his old dragoon sword and pistol, which hung over the mantelpiece, flanked by a pair of heavy single sticks, with which Benji himself had won renown long ago as an old gamester against the picked men of Wiltshire and Somersetshire in many a good bout at the revels and pastimes of the countryside. For he had been a famous back-swordman in his young days, and a good wrestler at elbow and collar. Back-swording and wrestling were the most serious holiday pursuits of the Vale, those by which men attained fame, and each village had its champion. I suppose that, on the whole, people were less worked then than they are now. At any rate, they seemed to have more time and energy for the old pastimes. The great times for back-swording came round once a year in each village, at the feast. The Vale VEASTs were not the common statute feasts, but much more ancient business. They are literally, so far as one can ascertain, feasts of the dedication. That is, they were first established in the churchyard on the day on which the village church was opened for public worship, which was on the wake or festival of the patron saint, and have been held on the same day in every year since that time. There was no longer any remembrance of why the VEAST had been instituted, but nevertheless it had a pleasant and almost sacred character of its own, for it was then that all the children of the village, wherever they were scattered, tried to get home for a holiday to visit their fathers and mothers and friends, bringing with them their wages or some little gift from up the country for the old folk. Perhaps for a day or two before, but at any rate on VEAST Day and the day after, in our village you might see strapping, healthy young men and women from all parts of the country going round from house to house in their best clothes and finishing up with a call on Madam Brown, whom they would consult as to putting out their earnings to the best advantage, or how best to expend the same for the benefit of the old folk. Every household, however poor, managed to raise a feast cake and a bottle of ginger or raisin wine, which stood on the cottage table ready for all comers, and not unlikely to make them remember feast time, for feast cake is very solid and full of huge raisins. Moreover, feast time was the day of reconciliation for the parish.
If Job Higgins and Noah Freeman hadn't spoken for the last 6 months, their old women would be sure to get it patched up by that day. And though there was a good deal of drinking and low vice in the booths of an evening, it was pretty well confined to those who would have been doing the like VEAST or no VEAST. And on the whole, the effect was humanizing and Christian. In fact, the only reason why this is not the case still is that gentlefolk and farmers have taken to other amusements and have, as usual, forgotten the poor. They don't attend the feasts themselves and call them disreputable, whereupon the steadiest of the poor leave them also, and they become what they are called. Class amusements, be they for dukes or ploughboys, always become nuisances and curses to a country. The true charm of cricket and hunting is that they are still more or less sociable and universal. There's a place for every man who will come and take his part.
No one in the village enjoyed the approach of VEAST Day more than Tom in the year in which he was taken under old Benji's tutelage. The feast was held in a large green field at the lower end of the village. The road to Farringdon ran along one side of it, and the brook by the side of the road. And above the brook was another large, gentle, sloping pasture land, with a footpath running down it from the churchyard. And the old church, the originator of all the mirth, towered up with its gray walls and lancet windows, overlooking and sanctioning the whole, though its own share therein had been forgotten. At the point where the footpath crossed the brook and road and entered on the field where the feast was held, was a long, low roadside inn, and on the opposite side of the field was a large white thatched farmhouse where dwelt an old sporting farmer, a great promoter of the revels. Past the old church and down the footpath pottered the old man and the child, hand in hand, early on the afternoon of the day before the feast, and wandered all round the ground, which was already being occupied by the cheapjacks with their green-covered carts and marvelous assortment of wares, and the booths of more legitimate small traders, with their tempting arrays of fairings and eatables, and penny peep shows and other shows containing pink-eyed ladies and dwarfs and boa constrictors and wild Indians. But the object of most interest to Benji, and of course to his pupil also, was the stage of rough planks, some 4 feet high, which was being put up by the village carpenter for the back sorting and wrestling. And after surveying the whole tenderly, old Benji led his charge away to the roadside inn, where he ordered a glass of ale and a long pipe for himself, and discussed these unwanted luxuries on the bench outside in the soft autumn evening, with mine host, another old servant of the Browns, and speculated with him on the likelihood of a good show of old gamesters to contend for the morrow's prizes, and told tales of the gallant bouts of 40 years back, to which Tom listened with all his ears and eyes. But who shall tell the joy of the next morning, when the church bells were ringing a merry peal, and old Benji appeared in the servants' hall, resplendent in a long blue coat and brass buttons, and a pair of old yellow buckskins and top boots, which he had cleaned for and inherited from Tom's grandfather, a stout thorn stick in his hand, and a nosegay of pinks and lavender in his buttonhole, and led away Tom in his best clothes and 2 new shillings in his breeches pockets. Those two, at any rate, look like enjoying the day's revel. They quicken their pace when they get into the churchyard, for already they see the field thronged with country folk, the men in clean white smocks or velveteen or fustian coats, with rough plush waistcoats of many colors, and the women in the beautiful long scarlet cloak, the usual outdoor dress of West Country women in those days, and which often descended in families from mother to daughter, or in new-fashioned stuff shawls, which, if they would but believe it, don't become them half so well. The air resounds with the pipe and tabor, and the drums and trumpets of the showmen shouting at the doors of their caravans, over which tremendous pictures of the wonders to be seen within hang temptingly, while through all rises the shrill root-toot-toot-toot of Mr. Punch and the unceasing panpipe of his satellite. "Lauk-a-massy, Mr. Benjamin," cries a stout, motherly woman in a red cloak as they enter the field. Be that you? Well, I never. You do look purely. And how's the squire and madam and the family?" Benji graciously shakes hands with the speaker, who has left our village for some years, but has come over for VEAST Day on a visit to an old gossip, and gently indicates the heir apparent of the Browns. "Bless his little heart, I must gie him a kiss. Here, Susanna, Susanna," cries she, raising herself from the embrace. "Come and see Mr. Benjamin and young Master Tom. You minds our Sukey, Mr. Benjamin. She be growed a rare slip of a wench since you seen her, though her'll be 16 come Martinmas. I do aim to take her to see Madam, to get her a place."
And Sukey comes bouncing away from a knot of old schoolfellows and drops a curtsy to Mr. Benjamin. And elders come up from all parts to salute Benji, and girls who have been Madam's pupils to kiss Master Tom. And they carry him off to load him with fairings, and he returns to Benji, his hat and coat covered with ribbons, and his pockets crammed with wonderful boxes which open upon ever new boxes, and pop guns and trumpets and apples and gilt gingerbread from the stall of Angel Heavens, sole vendor thereof, whose booth groans with kings and queens and elephants and prancing steeds, all gleaming with gold. There was more gold on Angel's cakes than there is ginger in those of this degenerate age. Skilled diggers might yet make a fortune in the churchyards of the Vale by carefully washing the dust of the consumers of Angel's gingerbread. Alas, he is with his namesakes, and his receipts have, I fear, died with him. And then they inspect the penny peep show, at least Tom does, while old Benji stands outside and gossips, and walks up the steps, and enters the mysterious doors of the pink-eyed lady and the Irish giant, who do not by any means come up to their pictures. And the boa will not swallow his rabbit, but there the rabbit is, waiting to be swallowed. And what can you expect for tuppence? We are easily pleased in the Vale. Now there is a rush of the crowd, and a tinkling bell is heard, and shouts of laughter. And Master Tom mounts on Benji's shoulders, and beholds a jingling match in all its glory. The games are begun, and this is the opening of them. It is a quaint game, immensely amusing to look at, and as I don't know whether it is used in your counties, I had better describe it. A large roped ring is made, into which are introduced a dozen or so of big boys and young men who mean to play. These are carefully blinded and turned loose into the ring, and then a man is introduced, not blindfolded, with a bell hung round his neck and his 2 hands tied behind him. Of course, every time he moves, the bell must ring, as he has no hand to hold it, and so the dozen blindfolded men have to catch him. This they cannot always manage if he is a lively fellow, but half of them always rush into the arms of the other half, or drive their heads together, or tumble over, and then the crowd laughs vehemently and invents nicknames for them on the spur of the moment. And they, if they be choleric, tear off the handkerchiefs which blind them, and not unfrequently pitch into one another, each thinking that the other must have run against him on purpose. It is great fun to look at a jingling match, certainly, and Tom shouts and jumps on old Benji's shoulders at the sight until the old man feels weary and shifts him to the strong young shoulders of the groom, who has just got down to the fun. And now, while they are climbing the pole in another part of the field and muzzling in a flower tub in another, the old farmer, whose house, as has been said, overlooks the field, and who is master of the revels, gets up the steps onto the stage and announces to all whom it may concern that a half-sovereign in money will be forthcoming to the old gamester who breaks most heads, to which the squire and he have added a new hat. The amount of the prize is sufficient to stimulate the men of the immediate neighborhood, but not enough to bring any very high talent from a distance. So, after a glance or two round, a tall fellow, who is a down shepherd, chucks his hat onto the stage and climbs up the steps, looking rather sheepish. The crowd, of course, first cheer, and then chaff as usual, as he picks up his hat and begins handling the sticks to see which will suit him.
"Why, Willum Smith, thee canst play with the arrow day," says his companion to the blacksmith's apprentice, a stout young fellow of 19 or 20. Willem's sweetheart is in the feast somewhere and has strictly enjoined him not to get his head broke at backswording on pain of her highest displeasure. But as she is not to be seen, the women pretend not to like to see the backsword play and keep away from the stage, and as his hat is decidedly getting old, he chucks it onto the stage and follows himself, hoping that he will only have to break other people's heads, or that, after all, Rachel won't really mind. Then follows the greasy cap lined with fur of a half-gypsy, poaching, loafing fellow who travels the Vale not for much good, I fancy. For 20 times was Peter feared, for once that Peter was respected, in fact. And then 3 or 4 other hats, including the glossy castor of Joe Willis, the self-elected and would-be champion of the neighborhood, a well-to-do young butcher of 28 or thereabouts, and a great strapping fellow with his full allowance of bluster. This is a capital show of gamesters, considering the amount of the prize. So while they are picking their sticks and drawing their lots, I think I must tell you, as shortly as I can, how the noble old game of backsword is played, for it is sadly gone out of late, even in the Vale, and maybe you have never seen it. The weapon is a good stout ash stick with a large basket handle, heavier and somewhat shorter than a common single stick. The players are called old gamesters, why I can't tell you, and their object is simply to break one another's heads. For the moment that blood runs an inch anywhere above the eyebrow, the old gamester to whom it belongs is beaten and has to stop. A very slight blow with the sticks will fetch blood, so that it is by no means a punishing pastime if the men don't play on purpose and savagely at the body and arms of their adversaries. The old gamester going into action only takes off his hat and coat and arms himself with a stick. He then loops the fingers of his left hand in a handkerchief or strap, which he fastens round his left leg, measuring the length so that when he draws it tight with his left elbow in the air, that elbow shall just reach as high as his crown. Thus, you see, so long as he chooses to keep his left elbow up, regardless of cuts, he has a perfect guard for the left side of his head. Then he advances his right hand above and in front of his head, holding his stick across so that its point projects an inch or 2 over his left elbow, and thus his whole head is completely guarded, and he faces his man armed in like manner, and they stand some 3 feet apart, often nearer, and feint and strike and return at one another's heads, until one cries, "Hold," or blood flows. In the first case, they are allowed a minute's time, and go on again. In the latter, another pair of gamesters are called on. If good men are playing, the quickness of the returns is marvelous. You hear the rattle, like that a boy makes drawing his stick along palings, only heavier, and the closeness of the men in action to one another gives it a strange interest and makes a spell at backswording a very noble sight. They are all suited now with sticks, and Joe Willis and the gypsy man have drawn the first lot, so the rest lean against the rails of the stage, and Joe and the dark man meet in the middle, the boards having been strewed with sawdust. Joe's white shirt and spotless drab breeches and boots contrasting with the gypsy's coarse blue shirt and dirty green velveteen breeches and leather gaiters. Joe is evidently turning up his nose at the other and half insulted at having to break his head. The gypsy is a tough, active fellow, but not very skillful with his weapon, so that Joe's weight and strength tell in a minute. He is too heavy metal for him. Whack, whack, whack come his blows, breaking down the gypsy's guard and threatening to reach his head every moment. There it is at last. "Blood, blood!" shout the spectators, as a thin stream oozes out slowly from the roots of his hair, and the umpire calls to them to stop. The gypsy scowls at Joe under his brows in no pleasant manner, while Master Joe swaggers about and makes attitudes and thinks himself and shows that he thinks himself the greatest man in the field. Then follow several stout sets to between the other candidates for the new hat, and at last come the shepherd and Willem Smith. This is the crack set to of the day. They are both in famous wind, and there is no crying hold. The shepherd is an old hand, and up to all the dodges. He tries them one after another and very nearly gets at Willem's head by coming in near and playing over his guard at the half-stick. But somehow Willem blunders through, catching the stick on his shoulders, neck, sides, every now and then, anywhere but on his head. And his returns are heavy and straight. And he is the youngest gamester and a favorite in the parish. And his gallant stand brings down shouts and cheers. And the knowing ones think he'll win if he keeps steady. And Tom, on the groom's shoulder, holds his hands together and can hardly breathe for excitement. Alas for Willem! His sweetheart, getting tired of female companionship, has been hunting the booths to see where he can have got to, and now catches sight of him on the stage in full combat. She flushes and turns pale. Her old aunt catches hold of her, saying, "Blessy child, don't 'ee go and nixt it!" But she breaks away and runs towards the stage, calling his name. Willem keeps up his guard stoutly, but glances for a moment towards the voice. No guard will do it, Willem, without the eye. The shepherd steps round and strikes, and the point of his stick just grazes Willem's forehead, fetching off the skin, and the blood flows, and the umpire cries "hold," and poor Willem's chance is up for the day. But he takes it very well, and puts on his old hat and coat, and goes down to be scolded by his sweetheart, and led away out of mischief. Tom hears him say coaxingly as he walks off, "Now don't 'ee, Rachel, I wouldn't have done it, only I wanted summat to buy ye a faring wi, and I be as flush o' money as a twat of feathers." "Thee mind what I tells 'ee," rejoins Rachel saucily, "and don't 'ee keep bletherin' about fairings." Tom resolves in his heart to give Willem the remainder of his 2 shillings after the backswording.
Joe Willis has all the luck today. His next bout ends in an easy victory, while the shepherd has a tough job to break his second head. And when Joe and the shepherd meet, and the whole circle expect and hope to see him get a broken crown, the shepherd slips in the first round and falls against the rails, hurting himself so that the old farmer will not let him go on, much as he wishes to try. And that impostor Joe, for he is certainly not the best man, struts and swaggers about the stage the conquering gamester, though he hasn't had 5 minutes really trying play. Joe takes the new hat in his hand and puts the money into it, and then, as if a thought strikes him, and he doesn't think his victory quite acknowledged down below, walks to each face of the stage and looks down, shaking the money, and chaffing as how he'll stake hat and money and another half-sovereign agin any gamester as hasn't played already. Cunning Joe. He thus gets rid of Willem and the shepherd, who is quite fresh again. No one seems to like the offer, and the umpire is just coming down when a queer old hat, something like a Doctor of Divinity's shovel, is chucked onto the stage, and an elderly, quiet man steps out, who has been watching the play, saying he should like to cross a stick with a prodigal-ish young chap. The crowd cheer and begin to chaff Joe, who turns up his nose and swaggers across to the sticks. "Impudent old waspard," says he, "I'll break the bald head on unto the truth." The old boy is very bald, certainly, and the blood will show fast enough if you can touch him, Joe. He takes off his long flapped coat and stands up in a long flapped waistcoat, which Sir Roger de Coverley might have worn when it was new, picks out a stick, and is ready for Master Joe, who loses no time but begins his old game, whack, 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 trying to break down the old man's guard by sheer strength. But it won't do. He catches every blow close by the basket, and though he is rather stiff in his returns, after a minute walks Joe about the stage and is clearly a staunch old gamester. Joe now comes in and, making the most of his height, tries to get over the old man's guard at half stick, by which he takes a smart blow in the ribs and another on the elbow, and nothing more. And now he loses wind and begins to puff, and the crowd laugh. "Cry hold, Joe! These met thy match!" Instead of taking good advice and getting his wind, Joe loses his temper and strikes at the old man's body. "Blood, blood," shout the crowd. "Joe's head's broke." Who'd have thought it? How did it come? That body blow left Joe's head unguarded for a moment, and with one turn of the wrist, the old gentleman has picked a neat little bit of skin off the middle of his forehead. And though he won't believe it, and hammers on for 3 more blows despite of the shouts, is then convinced by the blood trickling into his eye. Poor Joe is sadly crestfallen and fumbles in his pocket for the other half-sovereign. But the old gamester won't have it. "Keep thy money, man, and gi's thy hand," says he, and they shake hands. But the old gamester gives the new hat to the shepherd, and soon after, the half-sovereign to Willem, who thereout decorates his sweetheart with ribbons to his heart's content. "Who can a be? Where do a come from?" ask the crowd. And it soon flies about that the old West Country champion, who played a tie with Shaw the lifeguardsman at Vises 20 years before, has broken Joe Willis's crown for him.
How my country fair is spinning out. I see I must skip the wrestling, and the boys jumping in sacks and rolling wheelbarrows blindfolded, and the donkey race, and the fight which arose thereout, marring the otherwise peaceful VEAST, and the frightened scurrying away of the female feast-goers, and descent of Squire Brown, summoned by the wife of one of the combatants to stop at, which he wouldn't start to do till he had got on his top boots. Tom is carried away by old Benjy, dog-tired and surfeited with pleasure, as the evening comes on and the dancing begins in the booths, and the Willem and Rachel in her new ribbons, and many another good lad and lass don't come away just yet, but have a good step out and enjoy it, and get no harm thereby. Yet we, being sober folk, will just stroll away up through the churchyard, and by the old yew tree, and get a quiet dish of tea, and a parley with our gossips, as the steady ones of our village do, and so to bed.
That's the fair, true sketch, as far as it goes, of one of the larger village feasts in the Vale of Berks when I was a little boy. They are much altered for the worse, I am told. I haven't been at one these 20 years, but I have been at the statute fairs in some West Country towns, where servants are hired and greater abominations cannot be found. What village feasts have come to, I fear in many cases, may be read in the pages of Yeast, though I never saw one so bad, thank God. Do you want to know why? It is because, as I said before, gentlefolk and farmers have left off joining or taking an interest in them. They don't either subscribe to the prizes or go down and enjoy the fun. Is this a good or a bad sign? I hardly know. Bad, sure enough, if it only arises from the further separation of classes, consequent on 20 years of buying cheap and selling dear, and its accompanying overwork, or because our sons and daughters have their hearts in London club life or so-called society, instead of in the old English home duties, because farmers' sons are aping fine gentlemen, and farmers' daughters caring more to make bad foreign music than good English cheeses. Good, perhaps, if it be that the time for the old VEAST has gone by, that it is no longer the healthy, sound expression of English country holiday-making, that, in fact, we as a nation have got beyond it and are in a transition state, feeling for and soon likely to find some better substitute. Only I have just got this to say before I quit the text. Don't let reformers of any sort think that they are going really to lay hold of the working boys and young men of England by any educational grapnel whatever, which isn't some bona fide equivalent for the games of the old country VEAST in it. Something to put in the place of the backsorting and wrestling and racing. Something to try the muscles of men's bodies and the endurance of their hearts, and to make them rejoice in their strength. In all the newfangled comprehensive plans which I see, this is all left out, and the consequence is that your great mechanics institutes end in intellectual priggism, and your Christian young men's societies in religious pharisaism. Well, well, we must bide our time. Life isn't all beer and skittles. But beer and skittles, or something better of the same sort, must form a good part of every Englishman's education.
If I could only drive this into the heads of you rising parliamentary lords and young swells who have your ways made for you, as the saying is, you who frequent palaver houses and West End clubs, waiting always ready to strap yourselves on to the back of poor dear old John as soon as the present used-up lot, your fathers and uncles, who sit there on the great parliamentary majority's pack saddle and make believe they're guiding him with their red tape bridle, tumble or have to be lifted off.
I don't think much of you yet. I wish I could, though you do go talking and lecturing up and down the country to crowded audiences and are busy with all sorts of philanthropic intellectualism and circulating libraries and museums and heaven only knows what besides, and try to make us think, through newspaper reports, that you are, even as we, of the working classes. But bless your hearts, we ain't so green, though lots of us of all sorts toady you enough, certainly, and try to make you think so. I'll tell you what to do now. Instead of all this trumpeting and fuss, which is only the old parliamentary majority dodge over again, just you go, each of you. You've plenty of time for it, if you'll only give up to the line, and quietly make 3 or 4 friends, real friends, among us. You'll find a little trouble in getting at the right sort, because such birds don't come lightly to your lure, but found they may be. Take, say, 2 out of the professions, lawyer, parson, doctor, which you will, 1 out of trade, and 3 or 4 out of the working classes, tailors, engineers, carpenters, engravers. There's plenty of choice. Let them be men of your own ages, mind, and ask them to your homes. Introduce them to your wives and sisters, and get introduced to theirs. Give them good dinners, and talk to them about what is really at the bottom of your hearts, and box and run and row with them when you have a chance. Do all this honestly, as man to man, and by the time you come to ride old John, you'll be able to do something more than sit on his back, and may feel his mouth with some stronger bridle than a red tape one. Ah, if you only would. But you have got too far out of the right rut, I fear. Too much over-civilization and the deceitfulness of riches. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. More's the pity. I never came across but 2 of you who could value a man wholly and solely for what was in him, who thought themselves verily and indeed of the same flesh and blood as John Jones the attorney's clerk and Bill Smith the costermonger, and could act as if they thought so. Chapter 3. Sundry Wars and Alliances.
Poor old Benji. The rumour 'tis has much to answer for all through English countrysides, but it never played a scurvier trick than in laying thee by the heels when thou wast yet in a green old age. The enemy, which had long been carrying on a sort of border warfare and trying his strength against Benji's on the battlefield of his hands and legs, now, mustering all his forces, began laying siege to the citadel and overrunning the whole country. Benji was seized in the back and loins, and though he made strong and brave fight, it was soon clear enough that all which could be beaten of poor old Benji would have to give in before long. It was as much as he could do now, with the help of his big stick and frequent stops, to hobble down to the canal with Master Tom and bait his hook for him and sit and watch his angling, telling him quaint old country stories. And when Tom had no sport, and detecting a rat some 100 yards or so off along the bank, would rush off with Toby the Turnspit Terrier, his other faithful companion, in bootless pursuit, he might have tumbled in and been drowned 20 times over before Benji could have got near him.
Cheery and unmindful of himself, as Benji was, this loss of locomotive power bothered him greatly. He had got a new object in his old age, and was just beginning to think himself useful again in the world. He feared much, too, lest Master Tom should fall back again into the hands of charity and the women. So he tried everything he could think of to get set up. He even went an expedition to the dwelling of one of those queer mortals who, say what we will, and reason how we will, do cure simple people of diseases of one kind or another without the aid of physic,
and so get to themselves the reputation of using charms, and inspire for themselves and their dwellings great respect, not to say fear, amongst a simple folk, such as the dwellers in the Vale of Whitehorse. Where this power, or whatever else it may be, descends upon the shoulders of a man whose ways are not straight, he becomes a nuisance to the neighbourhood, a receiver of stolen goods, giver of love potions, and deceiver of silly women, the avowed enemy of law and order, of justices of the peace, head boroughs, and gamekeepers. Such a man, in fact, as was recently caught tripping and deservedly dealt with by the Leeds justices for seducing a girl who had come to him to get back a faithless lover and has been convicted of bigamy since then. Sometimes, however, they are of quite a different stamp, men who pretend to nothing and are with difficulty persuaded to exercise their occult arts in the simplest cases.
Of this latter sort was old Farmer Ives, as he was called, the wise man to whom Benjy resorted, taking Tom with him as usual, in the early spring of the year next after the feast described in the last chapter. Why he was called Farmer, I cannot say, unless it be that he was the owner of a cow, a pig or two, and some poultry, which he maintained on about an acre of land enclosed from the middle of a wild common, on which probably his father had squatted before lords of manors looked as keenly after their rights as they do now. Here he had lived no one knew how long, a solitary man. It was often rumored that he was to be turned out and his cottage pulled down, but somehow it never came to pass, and his pigs and cow went grazing on the common, and his geese hissed at the passing children and at the heels of the horse of my lord steward, who often rode by with a covetous eye on the enclosure still unmolested. His dwelling was some miles from our village, so Benjy, who was half ashamed of his errand and wholly unable to walk there, had to exercise much ingenuity to get the means of transporting himself and Tom thither without exciting suspicion. However, one fine May morning, he managed to borrow the old blind pony of our friend the publican, and Tom persuaded Madam Brown to give him a holiday to spend with old Benjy, and to lend them the squire's light cart, stored with bread and cold meat and a bottle of ale. And so the two in high glee started behind old Dobbin, and jogged along the deep-rutted plashy roads, which had not been mended after their winter's wear, towards the dwelling of the wizard. About noon, they passed the gate which opened onto the large common, and old Dobbin toiled slowly up the hill, while Benjy pointed out a little deep dingle on the left, out of which welled a tiny stream. As they crept up the hill, the tops of a few birch trees came in sight, and blue smoke curling up through their delicate light boughs. And then the little white-thatched home and enclosed ground of Farmer Ives, lying cradled in the dingle, with the gay gorse common rising behind and on both sides, while in front, after traversing a gentle slope, the eye might travel for miles and miles over the rich vale. They now left the main road and struck into a green track over the common, marked lightly with wheel and horseshoe, which led down into the dingle and stopped at the rough gate of Farmer Ives. Here they found the farmer, an iron-gray old man with a bushy eyebrow and strong aquiline nose, busied in one of his vocations. He was a horse and cow doctor, and was tending a sick beast which had been sent up to be cured. Benjy hailed him as an old friend, and he returned the greeting cordially enough, looking, however, hard for a moment, both at Benjy and Tom, to see whether there was more in their visit than appeared at first sight. It was a work of some difficulty and danger for Benjy to reach the ground, which, however, he managed to do without mishap, and then he devoted himself to unharnessing Dobbin and turning him out for a graze. A run, one could not say of that virtuous steed, on the common. This done, he extricated the cold provisions from the cart, and they entered the farmer's wicket, and he, shutting up the knife with which he was taking maggots out of the cow's back and sides, accompanied them towards the cottage. A big old lurcher got up slowly from the doorstone, stretching first one hind leg and then the other, and taking Tom's caresses and the presence of Toby, who kept, however, at a respectful distance, with equal indifference.
Us be come to pay ye a visit. I've been long-minded to do it for old sake's sake, only I finds I don't get about now as I used to it. I be so plaguey bad with the rheumatiz in my back."
Benji paused, in hopes of drawing the farmer at once on the subject of his ailments, without further direct application.
"Ah, I see as you bean't quite so lissome as you was," replied the farmer, with a grim smile, as he lifted the latch of his door. "We bean't so young as we was, nother on us, wuss luck."
The farmer's cottage was very like those of the better class of peasantry in general. A snug chimney corner with 2 seats and a small carpet on the hearth, an old flint gun and a pair of spurs over the fireplace, a dresser with shelves on which some bright pewter plates and crockeryware were arranged, an old walnut table, a few chairs and settles, some framed samplers, and an old print or two, and a bookcase with some dozen volumes on the walls, a rack with flitches of bacon and other stores fastened to the ceiling, and you have the best part of the furniture. No sign of occult art is to be seen, unless the bundles of dried herbs hanging to the rack and in the ingle, and the row of labeled files on one of the shelves betoken it. Tom played about with some kittens who occupied the hearth, and with a goat who walked demurely in at the open door, while their host and Benji spread the table for dinner, and was soon engaged in conflict with the cold meat, to which he did much honor. The 2 old men's talk was of old comrades and their deeds, mute inglorious Miltons of the Vale, and of the doings 30 years back, which didn't interest him much, except when they spoke of the making of the canal, and then indeed he began to listen with all his ears, and learned to his no small wonder that his dear and wonderful canal had not been there always, was not in fact so old as Benji or Farmer Ives, which caused a strange commotion in his small brain. After dinner, Benji called attention to a wart which Tom had on the knuckles of his hand, and which the family doctor had been trying his skill on without success, and begged the farmer to charm it away. Farmer Ives looked at it, muttered something or another over it, and cut some notches in a short stick, which he handed to Benji, giving him instructions for cutting it down on certain days, and cautioning Tom not to meddle with the wart for a fortnight. And then they strolled out and sat on a bench in the sun with their pipes, and the pigs came up and grunted sociably and let Tom scratch them, and the farmer, seeing how he liked animals, stood up and held his arms in the air and gave a call which brought a flock of pigeons wheeling and dashing through the birch trees. They settled down in clusters on the farmer's arms and shoulders, making love to him and scrambling over one another's backs to get to his face, and then he threw them all off, and they fluttered about close by and lighted on him again and again when he held up his arms. All the creatures about the place were clean and fearless, quite unlike their relations elsewhere, and Tom begged to be taught how to make all the pigs and cows and poultry in our village tame, at which the farmer only gave one of his grim chuckles. It wasn't till they were just ready to go, and old Dobbin was harnessed, that Benji broached the subject of his rheumatism again, detailing his symptoms one by one. Poor old boy. He hoped the farmer could charm it away as easily as he could Tom's wart, and was ready with equal faith to put another notched stick into his other pocket for the cure of his own ailments. The physician shook his head, but nevertheless produced a bottle and handed it to Benji with instructions for use. "Not as 'twill do 'ee much good, leastways I be afeared not," shading his eyes with his hand and looking up at them in the cart. "There's only one thing as I knows on as'll cure old folks like you and I of the rheumatiz." "What be that then, farmer?" inquired Benji. "Churchyard mold," said the old iron-grey man with another chuckle. And so they said their goodbyes and went their ways home. Tom's wart was gone in a fortnight, but not so Benji's rheumatism, which laid him by the heels more and more. And though Tom still spent many an hour with him, as he sat on a bench in the sunshine or by the chimney corner when it was cold,
he soon had to seek elsewhere for his regular companions. Tom had been accustomed often to accompany his mother in her visits to the cottages, and had thereby made acquaintance with many of the village boys of his own age. There was Job Rudkin, son of Widow Rudkin, the most bustling woman in the parish. How she could ever have had such a stolid boy as Job for a child must always remain a mystery. The first time Tom went to their cottage with his mother, Job was not indoors, but he entered soon after and stood with both hands in his pockets, staring at Tom. Widow Rudkin, who would have had to cross Madam to get at young Hopeful, a breach of good manners of which she was wholly incapable, began a series of pantomime signs, which only puzzled him, and at last, unable to contain herself longer, burst out with, "Job, Job, where's thy cap?" "What, bean't he on my head, mother?" replied Job, slowly extricating one hand from a pocket and feeling for the article in question, which he found on his head sure enough, and left there, to his mother's horror and Tom's great delight.
Then there was poor Jacob Dodson, the half-witted boy, who ambled about cheerfully, undertaking messages and little helpful odds and ends for everyone, which, however, poor Jacob managed always hopelessly to embrangle. Everything came to pieces in his hands, and nothing would stop in his head. They nicknamed him Jacob Doodlecalf. But above all, there was Harry Winburn, the quickest and best boy in the parish. He might be a year older than Tom, but was very little bigger, and he was the Crichton of our village boys. He could wrestle and climb and run better than all the rest, and learned all that the schoolmaster could teach him faster than that worthy at all liked. He was a boy to be proud of, with his curly brown hair, keen gray eye, straight active figure, and little ears and hands and feet as fine as a lord's, as Charity remarked to Tom one day, talking, as usual, great nonsense. Lords' hands and ears and feet are just as ugly as other folks when they are children, as anyone may convince himself if he likes to look. Tight boots and gloves and doing nothing with them, I allow make a difference by the time they are 20. Now that Benji was laid on the shelf, and his young brothers were still under petticoat government, Tom, in search of companions, began to cultivate the village boys generally, more and more. Squire Brown, be it said, was a true blue Tory to the backbone, and believed honestly that the powers which be were ordained of God, and that loyalty and steadfast obedience were men's first duties. Whether it were in consequence or in spite of his political creed, I do not mean to give an opinion, though I have one, but certain it is that he held therewith diverse social principles not generally supposed to be true blue in color. Foremost of these, and the one which the squire loved to propound above all others, was the belief that a man is to be valued wholly and solely for that which he is in himself, for that which stands up in the four fleshly walls of him, apart from clothes, rank, fortune, and all externals whatsoever. Which belief I take to be a wholesome corrective of all political opinions, and, if held sincerely, to make all opinions equally harmless, whether they be blue, red, or green. As a necessary corollary to this belief, Squire Brown held further that it didn't matter a straw whether his son associated with lords' sons or plowmen's sons, provided they were brave and honest. He himself had played football and gone bird nesting with the farmers whom he met at vestry and the laborers who tilled their fields, and so had his father and grandfather with their progenitors. So he encouraged Tom in his intimacy with the boys of the village, and forwarded it by all means in his power, and gave them the run of a close for a playground, and provided bats and balls and a football for their sports. Our village was blessed, amongst other things, with a well-endowed school. The building stood by itself, apart from the master's house, on an angle of ground where 3 roads met, an old gray stone building with a steep roof and mullioned windows. On one of the opposite angles stood Squire Brown's stables and kennel, with their backs to the road, over which towered a great elm tree.
On the third stood the village carpenter and wheelwright's large open shop, and his house and the schoolmaster's, with long, low eaves, under which the swallows built by scores.
The moment Tom's lessons were over, he would now get him down to this corner by the stables and watch till the boys came out of school. He prevailed on the groom to cut notches for him in the bark of the elm so that he could climb into the lower branches. And there he would sit, watching the school door and speculating on the possibility of turning the elm into a dwelling place for himself and friends, after the manner of the Swiss Family Robinson. But the school hours were long and Tom's patience short, so that he soon began to descend into the street and go and peep in at the school door and the wheelwright's shop and look out for something to while away the time. Now, the wheelwright was a choleric man, and one fine afternoon, returning from a short absence, found Tom occupied with one of his pet adzes, the edge of which was fast vanishing under our hero's care. A speedy flight saved Tom from all but one sound cuff on the ears, but he resented this unjustifiable interruption of his first essays at carpentering, and still more the further proceedings of the wheelwright, who cut a switch and hung it over the door of his workshop, threatening to use it upon Tom if he came within 20 yards of his gate. So Tom, to retaliate, commenced a war upon the swallows who dwelt under the wheelwright's eaves, whom he harassed with sticks and stones, and being fleeter of foot than his enemy, escaped all punishment and kept him in perpetual anger. Moreover, his presence about the school door began to incense the master, as the boys in that neighborhood neglected their lessons in consequence, and more than once he issued into the porch, rod in hand, just as Tom bade a hasty retreat. And he and the wheelwright, laying their heads together, resolved to acquaint the squire with Tom's afternoon occupations, but in order to do it with effect, determined to take him captive and lead him away to judgment fresh from his evil doings.
This they would have found some difficulty in doing had Tom continued the war single-handed, or rather single-footed, for he would have taken to the deepest part of Pebbly Brook to escape them. But, like other active powers, he was ruined by his alliances. Poor Jacob Doodlecalf could not go to the school with the other boys, and one fine afternoon, about 3 o'clock, the school broke up at 4, Tom found him ambling about the street and pressed him into a visit to the school porch. Jacob, always ready to do what he was asked, consented, and the two stole down to the school together. Tom first reconnoitered the wheelwright's shop, and seeing no signs of activity, thought all safe in that quarter, and ordered at once an advance of all his troops upon the school porch. The door of the school was ajar, and the boys seated on the nearest bench at once recognized and opened a correspondence with the invaders. Tom, waxing bold, kept putting his head into the school and making faces at the master when his back was turned.
Poor Jacob, not in the least comprehending the situation, and in high glee at finding himself so near the school, which he had never been allowed to enter, suddenly, in a fit of enthusiasm, pushed by Tom and ambling 3 steps into the school, stood there, looking round him and nodding with a self-approving smile. The master, who was stooping over a boy's slate, with his back to the door, became aware of something unusual and turned quickly round. Tom rushed at Jacob and began dragging him back by his smock frock, and the master made at them, scattering forms and boys in his career. Even now they might have escaped, but that in the porch, barring retreat, appeared the crafty wheelwright, who had been watching all their proceedings. So they were seized, the school dismissed, and Tom and Jacob led away to Squire Brown as lawful prize, the boys following to the gate in groups and speculating on the result.
The squire was very angry at first, but the interview, by Tom's pleading, ended in a compromise. Tom was not to go near the school till 3 o'clock, and only then if he had done his own lessons well, in which case he was to be the bearer of a note to the master from Squire Brown, and the master agreed in such case to release 10 or 12 of the best boys an hour before the time of breaking up, to go off and play in the close.
the wheelwrights, adzes, and swallows were to be forever respected, and that hero and the master withdrew to the servants' hall to drink the squire's health, well satisfied with their day's work. The second act of Tom's life may now be said to have begun. The War of Independence had been over for some time. None of the women now, not even his mother's maid, dared offer to help him in dressing or washing. Between ourselves, he had often at first to run to Benji in an unfinished state of toilet. Charity and the rest of them seemed to take a delight in putting impossible buttons and ties in the middle of his back, but he would have gone without nether integuments altogether sooner than have had recourse to female valeting. He had a room to himself, and his father gave him 6 pence a week pocket money. All this he had achieved by Benji's advice and assistance. But now he had conquered another step in life, the step which all real boys so long to make. He had got amongst his equals in age and strength, and could measure himself with other boys. He lived with those whose pursuits and wishes and ways were the same in kind as his own.
The little governess who had lately been installed in the house found her work grow wondrously easy, for Tom slaved at his lessons in order to make sure of his note to the schoolmaster. So there were very few days in the week in which Tom and the village boys were not playing in their close by 3 o'clock. Prisoner's base, rounders, high cockalorum, cricket, football. He was soon initiated into the delights of them all, and though most of the boys were older than himself, he managed to hold his own very well. He was naturally active and strong, and quick of eye and hand, and had the advantage of light shoes and well-fitting dress, so that in a short time he could run and jump and climb with any of them. They generally finished their regular games half an hour or so before tea time, and then began trials of skill and strength in many ways. Some of them would catch the Shetland pony who was turned out in the field and get 2 or 3 together on his back, and the little rogue, enjoying the fun, would gallop off for 50 yards, and then turn around or stop short and shoot them onto the turf, and then graze quietly on till he felt another load. Others played at peg-top or marbles, while a few of the bigger ones stood up for a bout at wrestling. Tom at first only looked on at this pastime, but it had peculiar attractions for him, and he could not long keep out of it. Elbow and collar wrestling, as practiced in the western counties, was, next to back-swording, the way to fame for the youth of the Vale, and all the boys knew the rules of it, and were more or less expert. But Job Rudkin and Harry Winburn were the stars, the former stiff and sturdy, with legs like small towers, the latter pliant as India rubber and quick as lightning. Day after day they stood foot to foot and offered first one hand and then the other, and grappled and closed and swayed and strained, till a well-aimed crook of the heel or thrust of the loin took effect, and a fair backfall ended the matter. And Tom watched with all his eyes, and first challenged one of the less scientific, and threw him, and so one by one wrestled his way up to the leaders. Then, indeed, for months he had a poor time of it. It was not long, indeed, before he could manage to keep his legs against Job, for that hero was slow of offense, and gained his victories chiefly by allowing others to throw themselves against his immovable legs and loins. But Harry Winburn was undeniably his master, from the first clutch of hands when they stood up, down to the last trip which sent him onto his back on the turf. He felt that Harry knew more and could do more than he. Luckily, Harry's bright unconsciousness and Tom's natural good temper kept them from quarreling, and so Tom worked on, and trod more and more nearly on Harry's heels, and at last mastered all the dodges and falls except one. This one was Harry's own particular invention and pet. He scarcely ever used it except when hard pressed, but then out it came, and as sure as it did, over went poor Tom. He thought about that fall at his meals, in his walks, when he lay awake in bed, in his dreams, but all to no purpose, until Harry one day, in his open way, suggested to him how he thought it should be met, and in a week from that time, the boys were equal,
save only the slight difference of strength in Harry's favor, which some extra 10 months of age gave. Tom had often afterwards reason to be thankful for that early drilling, and above all, for having mastered Harry Winburn's fall. Besides their home games, on Saturdays, the boys would wander all over the neighborhood, sometimes to the downs or up to the camp, where they cut their initials out in the springy turf and watched the hawk soaring and the peart bird, as Harry Winburn called the gray plover, gorgeous in his wedding feathers, and so home, racing down the manger with many a roll among the thistles, or through Uffington Wood to watch the fox cubs playing in the green rides, sometimes to Rosybrook to cut long whispering reeds which grew there, to make panpipes of, sometimes to Moor Mills, where was a piece of old forest land, with short-browsed turf and tufted brambly thickets stretching under the oaks, amongst which rumour declared that a raven, last of his race, still lingered, or to the sandhills in vain quest of rabbits, and bird nesting in the season anywhere and everywhere. The few neighbours of the squire's own rank every now and then would shrug their shoulders as they drove or rode by a party of boys with Tom in the middle, carrying along bulrushes or whispering reeds, or great bundles of cowslip and meadowsweet, or young starlings or magpies, or other spoil of wood, brook, or meadow. And Lawyer Redtape might mutter to Squire Straightback at the board that no good would come of the young Browns if they were let run wild with all the dirty village boys, whom the best farmers' sons even would not play with. And the squire might reply with a shake of his head that his sons only mixed with their equals, and never went into the village without the governess or a footman. But luckily, Squire Brown was full as stiff-backed as his neighbours, and so went on his own way. And Tom and his younger brothers, as they grew up, went on playing with the village boys, without the idea of equality or inequality, except in wrestling, running, and climbing, ever entering their heads, as it doesn't till it's put there by Jack Nasties or fine ladies' maids.
I don't mean to say it would be the case in all villages, but it certainly was so in this one. The village boys were full as manly and honest, and certainly purer than those in a higher rank. And Tom got more harm from his equals in his first fortnight at a private school, where he went when he was 9 years old, than he had from his village friends from the day he left Charity's apron strings. Great was the grief amongst the village schoolboys when Tom drove off with the squire one August morning to meet the coach on his way to school. Each of them had given him some little present of the best that he had, and his small private box was full of peg taps, white marbles, called alley taws in the Vale, screws, birds' eggs, whipcord, Jews' harps, and other miscellaneous boys' wealth. Poor Jacob Doodlecalf, in floods of tears, had pressed upon him with spluttering earnestness his lame pet hedgehog. He had always some poor broken-down beast or bird by him. But this Tom had been obliged to refuse by the squire's order. He had given them all a great tea under the big elm in their playground, for which Madam Brown had supplied the biggest cake ever seen in our village, and Tom was really as sorry to leave them as they to lose him. But his sorrow was not unmixed with the pride and excitement of making a new step in life. And this feeling carried him through his first parting with his mother, better than could have been expected. Their love was as fair and whole as human love can be, perfect self-sacrifice on the one side, meeting a young and true heart on the other. It is not within the scope of my book, however, to speak of family relations, or I should have much to say on the subject of English mothers, aye, and of English fathers and sisters and brothers, too. Neither have I room to speak of our private schools. What I have to say is about public schools, those much abused and much belauded institutions, peculiar to England. So we must hurry through Master Tom's year at a private school as fast as we can. It was a fair average specimen, kept by a gentleman with another gentleman as second master, but it was little enough of the real work they did,
merely coming into school when lessons were prepared and all ready to be heard. The whole discipline of the school, out of lesson hours, was in the hands of the two ushers, one of whom was always with the boys in their playground, in the school, at meals, in fact, at all times and everywhere, till they were faithfully in bed at night.
Now, the theory of private schools is, or was, constant supervision out of school. Therein differing fundamentally from that of public schools. It may be right or wrong, but if right, this supervision surely ought to be the especial work of the headmaster, the responsible person. The object of all schools is not to ram Latin and Greek into boys, but to make them good English boys, good future citizens. And by far the most important part of that work must be done, or not done, out of school hours. To leave it, therefore, in the hands of inferior men is just giving up the highest and hardest part of the work of education. Were I a private schoolmaster, I should say, let who will hear the boys their lessons, but let me live with them when they are at play and rest.
The two ushers at Tom's first school were not gentlemen and very poorly educated, and were only driving their poor trade of usher to get such living as they could out of it. They were not bad men, but had little heart for their work, and of course were bent on making it as easy as possible. One of the methods by which they endeavored to accomplish this was by encouraging tale-bearing, which had become a frightfully common vice in the school in consequence, and had sapped all the foundations of school morality. Another was by favoring grossly the biggest boys, who alone could have given them much trouble, whereby those young gentlemen became most abominable tyrants, oppressing the little boys in all the small, mean ways which prevail in private schools.
Poor little Tom was made dreadfully unhappy in his first week by a catastrophe which happened to his first letter home. With huge labor, he had, on the very evening of his arrival, managed to fill 2 sides of a sheet of letter paper with assurances of his love for dear Mama, his happiness at school, and his resolves to do all she would wish. This missive, with the help of the boy who sat at the desk next him, also a new arrival, he managed to fold successfully. But this done, they were sadly put to it for means of sealing. Envelopes were then unknown, they had no wax, and dared not disturb the stillness of the evening schoolroom by getting up and going to ask the usher for some. At length, Tom's friend, being of an ingenious turn of mind, suggested sealing with ink, and the letter was accordingly stuck down with a blob of ink and duly handed by Tom, on his way to bed, to the housekeeper to be posted. It was not till 4 days afterwards that the good dame sent for him and produced the precious letter and some wax, saying, "Oh, Master Brown, I forgot to tell you before, but your letter isn't sealed." Poor Tom took the wax in silence and sealed his letter, with a huge lump rising in his throat during the process, and then ran away to a quiet corner of the playground and burst into an agony of tears. The idea of his mother waiting day after day for the letter he had promised her at once, and perhaps thinking him forgetful of her, when he had done all in his power to make good his promise, was as bitter a grief as any which he had to undergo for many a long year. His wrath, then, was proportionately violent when he was aware of 2 boys who stopped close by him, and one of whom, a fat gaby of a fellow, pointed at him and called him "young mammy-sick," whereupon Tom arose, and giving vent thus to his grief and shame and rage, smote his derider on the nose and made it bleed, which sent that young worthy howling to the usher, who reported Tom for violent and unprovoked assault and battery. Hitting in the face was a felony, punishable with flogging. Other hitting only a misdemeanor, a distinction not altogether clear in principle. Tom, however, escaped the penalty by pleading primum tempus, and having written a second letter to his mother, enclosing some forget-me-nots which he picked on their first half-holiday walk, felt quite happy again, and began to enjoy vastly a good deal of his new life. These half-holiday walks were the great events of the week.
The whole 50 boys started after dinner with one of the ushers for Hazeldown, which was distant some mile or so from the school. Hazeldown measured some 3 miles round, and in the neighbourhood were several woods full of all manner of birds and butterflies. The usher walked slowly round the down with such boys as liked to accompany him, the rest scattered in all directions, being only bound to appear again when the usher had completed his round, and accompany him home. They were forbidden, however, to go anywhere except on the down and into the woods. The village had been especially prohibited, where huge bullseyes and unctuous toffee might be procured in exchange for coin of the realm.
Various were the amusements to which the boys then betook themselves. At the entrance of the down there was a steep hillock, like the barrows of Tom's own downs. This mound was the weekly scene of terrific combats at a game called by the queer name of mud paddies. The boys who played divided into sides under different leaders, and one side occupied the mound. Then, all parties having provided themselves with many sods of turf, cut with their bread and cheese knives, the side which remained at the bottom proceeded to assault the mound, advancing up on all sides under cover of a heavy fire of toughs, and then struggling for victory with the occupants, which was theirs as soon as they could, even for a moment, clear the summit, when they in turn became the besieged. It was a good, rough, dirty game, and of great use in counteracting the sneaking tendencies of the school. Then others of the boys spread over the downs, looking for the holes of humblebees and mice, which they dug up without mercy, often, I regret to say, killing and skinning the unlucky mice, and, I do not regret to say, getting well stung by the bumblebees. Others went after butterflies and birds' eggs in their seasons, and Tom found on Hazeldown, for the first time, the beautiful little blue butterfly with golden spots on his wings, which he had never seen on his own downs, and dug out his first sand martin's nest. This latter achievement resulted in a flogging, for the sand martins built in a high bank close to the village, consequently out of bounds. But one of the bolder spirits of the school, who never could be happy unless he was doing something to which risk was attached, easily persuaded Tom to break bounds and visit the martin's bank. From whence, it being only a step to the toffee shop, what could be more simple than to go on there and fill their pockets? Or what more certain than that on their return, a distribution of treasure having been made, the usher should surely detect the forbidden smell of bullseyes, and, a search ensuing, discover the state of the breeches pockets of Tom and his ally. This ally of Tom's was indeed a desperate hero in the sight of the boys, and feared as one who dealt in magic, or something approaching thereto, which reputation came to him in this wise. The boys went to bed at 8, and, of course, consequently, lay awake in the dark for an hour or two, telling ghost stories by turns. One night, when it came to his turn, and he had dried up their souls by his story, he suddenly declared that he would make a fiery hand appear on the door, and to the astonishment and terror of the boys in his room, a hand, or something like it, in pale light, did then and there appear. The fame of this exploit having spread to the other rooms, and being discredited there, the young necromancer declared that the same wonder would appear in all the rooms in turn, which it accordingly did, and the whole circumstances having been privately reported to one of the ushers as usual, that functionary, after listening about at the doors of the rooms, by a sudden descent caught the performer in his nightshirt, with a box of phosphorus in his guilty hand. Lucifer matches and all the present facilities for getting acquainted with fire were then unknown. The very name of phosphorus had something diabolic in it to the boy mind. So Tom's ally, at the cost of a sound flogging, earned what many older folk covet much, the very decided fear of most of his companions. He was a remarkable boy, and by no means a bad one. Tom stuck to him till he left, and got into many scrapes by so doing. But he was the great opponent of the tale-bearing habits of the school, and the open enemy of the ushers, and so worthy of all support. Tom imbibed a fair amount of Latin and Greek at the school, but somehow on the whole it didn't suit him,
or he it, and in the holidays he was constantly working the squire to send him at once to a public school. Great was his joy then, when in the middle of his third half year, in October 1833, a fever broke out in the village, and the master having himself slightly sickened of it, the whole of the boys were sent off at a day's notice to their respective homes.
The squire was not quite so pleased as Master Tom to see that young gentleman's brown, merry face appear at home, some 2 months before the proper time, for the Christmas holidays. And so, after putting on his thinking cap, he retired to his study and wrote several letters, the result of which was that one morning at the breakfast table, about a fortnight after Tom's return, he addressed his wife with, "My dear, I have arranged that Tom shall go to Rugby at once for the last 6 weeks of this half year, instead of wasting them in riding and loitering about home. It is very kind of the doctor to allow it. Will you see that his things are all ready by Friday, when I shall take him up to town, and send him down the next day by himself?" Mrs. Brown was prepared for the announcement, and merely suggested a doubt whether Tom were yet old enough to travel by himself. However, finding both father and son against her on this point, she gave in, like a wise woman, and proceeded to prepare Tom's kit for his launch into a public school. End of Chapter 3, Part 1.